Hi and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. Now today's video is kind of a video response to a number of questions or comments or drive-by comments that appear on some of our videos to do with using the katana versus European swords. So what comes up, and it's usually not a question, it usually is, you're doing it wrong, which is actually kind of hilarious because most of the time when people on YouTube come out onto a martial arts video and say you're doing it wrong, usually comes from a position of quite ignorance actually, and the reason for that is they jump to massive conclusions about what they're seeing and why and what it represents, and there are all kinds of reasons for that. So a simple one would be looking at a sword fight and asking, yeah, but you're not considering armor. Well, it's not an armored fight, it's representing an unarmored fight, and that's a prime example of not really looking at or understanding, or even just reading the description to understand quite what it is you're seeing. And that's unfortunate. Unfortunately, it's not the majority of YouTubers, but it is a small minority. But the katana one gets particularly savage, and that's not so surprising because the katana and Japanese swordsmanship generally does have a massive following, and it has done since the kind of craze in the 60s and 70s that really kicked it off, in Europe that is. Now, this one about using the katana left-handed, I'll explain a little bit about the background of this and why it's come up, and then explain why it's been done and for what reasons. So first of all, when you see a katana in a video, katana is not a style. Katana is a sword. It's like saying saber, long sword, these kind of things. It's a type of sword. It can be used many different ways. There might be typical or traditional methods of using that sword, rightly so, but in itself is not a style. So if you see, a katana being used, it isn't inherently being used in one style. Usually it's sort of, well, that's not being used in a kendo style. Well, no, because kendo is a sport. It's like Olympic fencing. It's a comparatively modern construct based on more traditional methods. Now, with traditional methods of katana usage, if you just do a simple Google search and ask, were there any left-handed samurai? Were the katanas ever used left-handed? And what you're going to find is a few things. But mostly what you'll find is the Japanese always taught swordsmanship right-handed, and in many ways that is comparative to Europe as well, because there was this idea that left-handers were the sort of devil's spawn and all kinds of other things, or they had unfair advantages, lots of different reasons to not like left-handers. I mean, I don't like left-handers, they're a pain in the ass when you fence them actually, but historically speaking, they were taught to use the sword right-handed, and that means that the right hand, your lead hand, goes at the top of the sword and your other hand goes at the base of the grip. And in Japanese swordsmanship, the way that's working is that your right hand is basically a pivot position point, and your left hand is your power. So it uses the leverage of the grip off the left hand to generate power. And actually that's not so different to a lot of European two-handed sword stuff anyway. There's a lot of that within, say, the rationale type longsword usage. But yeah, that's the principle, is your lead hand goes at the top, your offhand or your left hand goes at the bottom. Whether you're left-handed or right-handed, they always taught the same way. And in much the same ways, you can go back to, say, old sword and shield and spear and shield, and it was always taught to use the shield on the left and the spear or sword in the right. And part of that is to tradition of not wanting left-handers, but a large amount of it is to do with formation fighting, and you always want the shield on the same side of each soldier. So there is some practical application to it as well. So yeah, according to those traditional methods, the katana should be wielded with the right hand at the top, left hand at the bottom of the grip. Doesn't matter whether you're naturally right or left-handed. Now, in one or two of our videos on katana versus saber and katana versus rapier, Borak, who's using the katana, goes to a left-handed grip. So a left-handed grip is the reverse. So where the left hand goes at the top and the right hand goes at the bottom. And the criticism of that is it's wrong. Well, it's not the standard traditional method. It doesn't mean historically it didn't exist, and it doesn't mean in a modern context it didn't exist. And again, if you do a search on Google, what you're going to find is, yes, the Japanese taught the sword to be used this way, and yet there are various schools that trained both ways to keep their body balanced, and also practiced the left hand to ensure that it could be used no matter what, in terms of obviously injury, whatever else. So there were methods that were used to use the left hand forward, and you will find some 19th century Japanese swordsmen who did practice the left-handed method as well. And again, just go on Google, you'll find it in a few minutes. There are all kinds of forums bringing up this. You can find it on Reddit, you can find it on Sword Forum. It comes up in lots of places. So it wouldn't be the norm, but it did exist, and there are reasons to do it. So, that already gives it some legitimacy. But, and this is the huge, huge but, and this is the most important aspect actually to what those fights were. Those fights were not katana versus katana, and they were not saber versus saber or rapier versus rapier. When you have matched weapons fighting against each other, and specifically matched styles, there's an expectation that it's going to represent that manual, that style, that tradition, whatever else, and you're going to get typical actions, typical responses to that kind of fight. So if it's a saber fight, you're going to expect lots of parry riposte. If it's a rapier fight, you're going to expect lots of basically blade engagements and trying to get blade domination. And if you see a Lecternauer fight with longsword, you're going to expect lots of binding and winding, you know, for example, and switches and that kind of thing. There are expectations, but where that significantly changes, or often significantly changes, is when you have a mixed weapon fight. And this is something not well understood by those who kind of stick to one weapon style, or even if they do mixed weapon styles or different weapon styles, they don't mix them in sparring. So they keep to saber versus saber, longsword versus longsword. And that, of course, is a very modern sportive concept. You think of Olympic fencing, foil only goes against foil, épée against épée, and saber against saber. And in a sportive construct, that makes all the sense in the world. And yet, historically speaking, we know that in many regards, it's more likely that a sword is going to face something different, whether it's a different kind of sword or a spear or something like that, than just a matched weapon. Of course, in a duel, you expect matched weapons, but there are so many different scenarios for a sword fight than just a duel. And that is a formal duel, because, of course, if it's informal or a brawl of some kind, it's not necessarily going to be matched at all. And going back to that point, okay, when you have mismatched weapons, you don't get essentially an orthodox fighting style, or not normally, because if somebody uses completely normal orthodox methods of their system against a very different kind of weapon, they usually find themselves coming up short, because that other weapon has advantages and disadvantages in its own way, and the style you're using often doesn't perfectly match it. And a good example of that would be if you use a long rapier against most other kinds of swords. So when we practice rapier, I practice from Capoferro, that's what I teach. You do a lot of blade engagements and blade domination, so you're seeking the other person's sword to get leverage against it and strike. But if you use a rapier against a katana or a longsword, it doesn't matter if you get that engagement. You have no leverage because they've got a two-handed grip, and therefore they will have more leverage than you, no matter what position you get your blade against on theirs. It doesn't matter whether you technically have more leverage against them on the blade, because they've got another hand on the grip, and therefore it doesn't really matter. And therefore, if you rapier against katana, rapier against longsword, you're going to want to avoid blade engagements. And that's why you see a lot of guards that are very, very low with the point down to the ground, so that basically they can't engage on the blade. And that's a prime example of how, when you have a mismatched or mixed weapon sparring bout, things do change out of necessity. And the same way that so many people with katana and longsword think that the way to beat a rapier is just to power in with force and strength. And that technically can work, of course, but against any competent rapierist, for example, you're going to find disengages and thrusts are just going to hit you to high hell over and over and over. And you just see suddenly, oh, powering in with a big cut is not the way to fight a rapier. In fact, the way to fight a rapier with a sword like this is to use very refined movement and just seek a blade engagement of some kind, at which point you can close on them, exactly like fighting a spear. So don't use your big, powerful blows until you've actually got the engagement, close the distance. And yeah, so this takes us back to the katana. This got a bit long-winded, but it needs the explanation, is why then would you go left-handed? Because Borak is not left-handed. He wasn't using the sword in a left-handed way because he's left-handed. It wasn't a mistake. It was an actual choice because of the situation. And actually, you can see the time he changes it. And I believe it's the when I'm fighting him with the saber against katana, and he starts in a traditional right hand forward stance or grip, and he changes mid-fight. So it's not that he got it wrong, it's a conscious decision based on what he's experiencing in the fight. And in fact, so many different martial arts throughout history have this principle of, improvise, adapt, and overcome your situation. And you do have to change certain things to meet the situation that you're in. So just because you fight a certain way with your katana versus another katana, if you meet a spear or a rapier, you may have to change certain things. And, that should be kind of obvious. Every fighting style does have to adapt to one another in certain ways to be able to overcome certain advantages and disadvantages. And anyway, the reason it happened with that fight. Now, we actually used synthetics back then for this fight, for those fights, because we only had synthetic katanas back then. So I've only recently got this steel katana in, which we've only just done one fight with, and because of lockdowns, it's hard to do many more. But we'll be back soon enough, and we'll be pitting this against all kinds of things. So this was the kind of combination that was being used. A British military sabre of the sort of Georgian period, sort of around 1800, and a typical sort of size katana. And you'll notice that in actual fact, they are roughly at the same blade length, but as a result, because this is used in one hand, it does have more reach than when you use this in two. I mean, yes, you can use a katana in one hand, but unless you're basically throwing it from the grip like this, which, you know, is legitimate, but it's not how you're going to be using it for every attack, you are going to have a massive reach disadvantage over the saber. And also the saber is generally just a little bit more agile than the katana, and that's, well, largely to do with mass distribution of the blade. Is the saber does tend, not always, but an infantry saber of this kind does tend to be a bit more agile than an equivalent katana, and has a bit more reach. And because it has only one hand on the grip, it also has a lot more dexterity, so you can strike from a range of different angles that a two-handed grip cannot. So a two-handed grip provides excellent leverage, which is fantastic in generating power, although more importantly, it's good at changing direction quickly. Whereas the one-handed grip gives you a bit more reach and a bit more dexterity. And in that fight, what Burak was finding is that I was exposing a weak point that I kept on hitting, and he learnt it in the fight before, I believe, and then in that one he remembered and changed what he was doing, and that's exactly the kind of thing you'd expect a competent fighter to do when they find a problem in a fight that they hadn't really encountered before, and you adapt and find ways to overcome it. And what it was is, in military saber, we very commonly use feints, okay? So a feint is a deception followed by an actual strike. And you can do multiples of them and all sorts. But one of the most common that you'll find in military saber is a feint cut one and then follow through to a cut two. And it's designed to strike against the outside arm here. Now, I do it a lot. It is by far one of my absolute favorite openings, if you like, because it's simple, it's done at wide measure, so that you're not going for a deep target, you're not exposing yourself too much, not taking too many risks, but you are aiming to take out their lead hand. So primary, one of the most important target zones of the fight, and you end it without having to close distance. It's a really, really good technique. So I use that an awful lot. And what he found is that when he was leading right hand forward, this was hugely exposed, and I just kept tagging it over and over. No matter what he did, no matter what his movement was, I was getting it a lot. And then what he found is if he shifted to a left hand stance, suddenly this arm wasn't coming out, it wasn't so exposed, and he was able to defend more easily. And the reverse with the saber, where you would feint two and cut one, is simply not as good in terms of body mechanics, and certainly I don't use it as much. So just because he's then mirrored, I wasn't able to take advantage of this arm so much as when I was able to take advantage of this arm. So ultimately, he changed to a left-handed grip, not because he's a left-hander, not because he doesn't know what he's doing. He did it to adapt to the scenario, and it worked because it proved a lot more difficult for me after that. And that is just so vital to when you use different weapons against one another, is you will find that certain things you do need to change and adapt. Just like I said with the rapier, there are certain things you will need to do differently or you'll get punished for. So just like the katana, people instinctively think, well, let's power in big cuts to open the fight. Well, if you're using that against a rapier or a small sword, somebody who's going to be quite deceptive with fast point work, you're going to get skewered on the way in an awful lot. And yeah, so that's a classic adaptation to basically the scenario you are experiencing. And again, remember that katana, not a style, it's a sword. Yes, there were typical styles used by it. And in fact, in a modern concept today, in this period, a lot of people think of Japanese swordsmanship as just kendo, which, as I said earlier, kendo is a modern sport. Some kendo schools do practice more traditional methods, but ultimately kendo exists to be a comparatively modern sport, just like Olympic fencing. So it has very restrictive rules and regulations on it in terms of what you can do and how. It isn't quite like historical Japanese sword styles. And Japanese swordsmanship was essentially codified in the late 19th century, as the uses of swords was basically going. And it was, the Japanese police, for example, were heavily involved with that, and they essentially codified it into a modern system of practice and sportsmanship. There were hundreds of different Japanese sword schools that didn't all practice the same method. It wasn't all unified, and it wasn't all identical, just as you might expect. This concept of there is one way to do something is a very modern, very sportive concept. And we can look at this all throughout history and see examples of why it's not true. So, for example, you could take a weapon like the rapier of, let's say, the 1600 period. So when rapiers were in the kind of golden era, they were their longest. Somebody might say, there's one way to use that sword, there's one way to stand, there's one way to act. And yet if you compare the way that it was being used in Italy, so if you look at Capoferro Fabri, and you look at the way it was being used under the Destreza system in Spain, they're using exactly the same weapon. Now, the Spanish did eventually go to cut hilts, but then so did the Italians, in fact. So around 1600, their swords were the same length, same size, same weight. And yet, the methods were completely different. So the Spanish tended to stay very fleet-footed and dancing around. The Italians stayed flat-footed and inline. Particularly when it comes to Capoferro wants you to always remain lead or right foot forwards at all times, and recommends not using left foot forwards and how to actually fight those who do. And yet the Spanish will go either foot forward. The Italians at that time tended to prefer a linear fighting style, or predominantly linear, whereas the Spanish famously liked to circle. And Capoferro says, don't actually make any movements unless it's done with intent. So when you're in motion, you are at risk, and you only move to actually commit to an action, whereas the Spanish constantly move as if it's a dance. And those two systems, one is not right and one is not wrong. They both are incredibly effective, and they both can generate very, very good fighters. But ultimately, they're using the same sword with different principles. And just the same can be said with pretty much any sword that we are looking at. So if I said specifically that we were doing it from one specific Kenjutsu school of swordsmanship, you could legitimately say, well then, yes, you are doing it wrong, or whatever else. But if you are going to go and look at somebody's technique and try and justify whether it's right or wrong or not, you need to know exactly what their training is, what they're representing, and why they're doing the things that they're doing. Because when it came to using a left-handed grip with the katana in those videos, there's a very specific reason for doing it. And it wasn't that I asked Burak to do it. I didn't ask him to do anything. So Burak, he does do Kenjutsu and various HEMA as well. And he found in those particular fights that that was an adaptation that was useful to counter certain actions that I was using against him. So there you go. There's the answer to you. In European swordsmanship, today, left-handedness is not discouraged by any of the schools that I've ever seen. So we have loads of left-handers. If you watch our YouTube videos, you're going to just see so many left-handers. And we just let them use their left hand or their right as they please. Historically speaking, yes, there were restrictions in certain times and places, and yet we know, because there are swords that are specifically designed with hilts that are for left-handers, they weren't that common, but we know they existed. So even like the Napoleonic period, you're going to find left-handed sabers, not that common at all. They are a minority, but they were done. And in terms of the military swordsmanship, we know that it wasn't taught to use the left, so we have to make some adaptations when we're teaching there. But we know that in practice, some people did go left-handed. And I hope you enjoyed the video. If you've got any comments or questions you'd like to know any more, please do post it in the comments section below. I did ramble a little bit there, but there's a lot to say on it. It's important because there's so much going on in a particular sparring bout that you need to really understand what the training is, what the purpose is, why people are adapting or changing the things that they're doing, and particularly when it comes to a mixed weapon fight. Don't judge a mixed weapon fight like a matched weapon fight, because it will almost never look the same. Because when you change certain parameters so much, like going from one-handed sword grip to two, or significant differences in blade length or blade mass, even large amounts of curvature versus straight blades, the amount of hand protection one has or not, all of these factors can make a massive impact on the way the fight goes. And if those two weapons are significantly different, you are going to likely see both fighters adapt to this scenario. So I do hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed, please do so. Thanks for watching.